Okay, thank you. Good morning. Thank you for joining this press conference by Ms. Irene Khan, who, as you know, is the Special Rapporteur on promotion and protection of the right of freedom of opinion and expression. Ms. Khan is here to brief you following her presentation, the presentation of her report to the Third Committee of the General Assembly yesterday afternoon. Her report is entitled Global Threats to Freedom of Expression Arising from the Conflict in Gaza. Special rapporteurs, as you know, are independent experts who are part of what we call the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. And without further ado, Ms. Khan, you have the floor.
Shall I speak from here?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. And I hope my meeting with you will help to clarify some concerns that I have about freedom of expression around the world that is not getting attention, and that is directly, I think, a result of what we see happening now in the occupied Palestinian territories. No conflict in recent times has threatened freedom of expression so seriously or so far beyond its borders than Gaza. And rarely have we seen, and this is what bothers me, extensive patterns of unlawful, discriminatory, and disproportionate restriction by states and private actors on freedom of expression. And at the Third Committee yesterday, I highlighted a few key areas, which I will talk about here too. First is the severe attacks on media in the occupied Palestinian territory, in Gaza, but also in West Bank and East Jerusalem. The targeted killings of journalists, the arbitrary detention of dozens of them, the extensive destruction of press facilities and equipment in Gaza, the denial of access to international journalists, as you know. I think only one has been permitted to enter by Israel, the banning of Al Jazeera, the tightening of censorship within Israel and in the occupied territories seem to indicate a strategy of the Israeli authorities to silence critical journalism and obstruct documentation of possible international crimes. We all know the deliberate killing of a journalist is a war crime, yet not a single killing of a journalist this past year, or for that matter in previous years in the occupied Palestinian territory, has ever been properly investigated, prosecuted, or punished. Impunity is total. Secondly, what I have seen, and I report to the Third Committee on, discrimination and double standards, restricting freedom of expression in support of Palestinian rights, and suppressing protests against the carnage in Gaza. Bans, including some blanket bans of pro-Palestinian demonstrations, have been imposed in many European countries. Campus protests, as you know, in the United States earlier this year were crushed harshly. Public display of Palestinian national symbols like the flag or the keffiyeh and certain slogans have been prohibited, even criminalized in some countries. Such blanket discriminatory prohibitions of speech, protest, and slogans are inherently incompatible with international human rights because they fail to meet the test of necessity, proportionality, and the principle of non-discrimination. And this failure to respect international standards is an issue of global concern because it sends a message around the world that freedom of expression can be suppressed at will or with political expediency. Thirdly, we also see the silencing and sidelining of dissenting voices in academia and in the arts. Some of the best academic institutions in the world, as you know, have failed to ensure equal protection to all members of their academic communities, whether Jewish, Palestinian, Israeli, Arab, Muslim, or otherwise. And intellectual intercourse has been diminished. Artistic freedom is being censored in many institutions in Western countries. I received complaints from scholars about a chilling effect on their academic research, on their policy discourse relating to the Palestinian situation or to Israeli policies. And artists and writers, as you know, have been threatened, isolated, excluded from events because they express their views on the Gaza conflict or criticized Israel or failed to criticize Israel. So on all sides, this kind of discrimination is occurring. And it is extremely damaging, of course, to both academic freedom and artistic freedom, which, as we know, is the lifeblood of democratic societies. The fourth point I want to make is about social media platforms. They have been a lifeline for communications to and from people in Gaza, but at the same time, they have also been major vectors of disinformation, misinformation, and hate speech. While Arabs, Jewish Israelis, and Palestinians are all targeted online, many companies, most companies actually, have shown a bias in their responses. As far as I could see, all of them were showing a bias in their responses, being more lenient regarding Israel and more restrictive about Palestinian expression. And from what I can see, it seems that inherently biased policies, opaque, inconsistent content moderation, and heavy reliance on automated tools have led to this over-restrictive, unbalanced content moderation. Fifthly, and this is a controversial issue, but I stand my ground on this, online and offline, international legal standards are being distorted and misinterpreted to conflate criticism of Israel and Zionism with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is racial, the worst form of racial and religious hatred of Jews, and must be unequivocally condemned. But conflating protected speech, which is political criticism, with prohibited speech, which is hate speech, undermines the fight against anti-Semitism, and it also chills freedom of expression. Israel is a state, Zionism is a political ideology, and under international human rights law, no state and no political ideology can be shielded for criticism. Where the term Zionist is used as a proxy to mean Jew, there, of course, international law says, as in the case of other incitement, advocacy for incitement, there are guidelines, specific guidelines that need to be used to determine whether this is indeed incitement or not, but a blanket protection of Zionist speech is not permissible under international law. These issues, the genocide in Gaza, the violation of human rights in the occupied territories, Israel's disregard and violations of international law, Israel's unlawful occupation of Palestinian territory, these are issues of global public interest, and they are, like all other issues of global public interest, subject to public scrutiny and criticism, valid public scrutiny and criticism under international law. My report sets out various recommendations to states. I will not run through them, but I will respond to any questions you have on it. But the point I want to make is equality is a fundamental principle of human rights. And states, companies, and private institutions are obliged to uphold that right to equality in the context of the right to freedom of expression of all persons. And any restriction, there are very clear guidelines laid down in international law as how they should be made, and those guidelines are not being followed. There is now, of course, the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the unlawful illegality of the occupation by Israel. And reading that judgment, it would seem that there is an encouragement now from the International Criminal Court to all states to repeal laws and policies that discourage, punish, or impede peaceful advocacy against Israel's unlawful occupation. There are many countries that still have laws that make it prohibit movements such as, the BDS movements and so on. But since the International Criminal Court has determined that the occupation is unlawful, therefore advocacy against an unlawful act is lawful. And, of course, attacks on the media in the occupied Palestinian territory are an attack on the right to information of people around the world who want to know what is happening there. And I have called on the General Assembly and the Security Council to take all measures to strengthen the protection of journalists as essential civilian workers. They are protected under humanitarian law as civilians. However, they are not like many other civilians. They cannot seek safety. They cannot move out of the conflict zone. Their job is to go actually towards the conflict, not away from it. And we, as members of global society, people, the civilians in Palestine, everyone looks to the information that we get. It's very valuable. The right to information is a survival right in times of conflict. And in that kind of a situation, I believe journalists need specific, clear protection in the same way that other humanitarian workers receive. And journalism should be seen as essential as the humanitarian work. Let me end by just making the point that history has shown us the freedom of opinion and expression, when enjoyed equally by all, is a valuable tool for fighting hatred, building trust, encouraging dialogue, rather than violence as a means of resolving dispute. And given what we are seeing now happening in the Middle East, I believe freedom of expression is more important than ever, not just in the Middle East, but around the world on these issues, so that people can come around the table, talk about it, resolve disputes, rather than applying discriminatory measures that shut down one side and only favor another. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Khan. We're now open to questions. Edie, please.
Thank you very much, Ms. Khan. Always nice to see you back here. Edith Lederer from the Associated Press on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Thank you for doing this briefing, and thank you, I'm sure, on behalf of everybody in UNCA for doing what you can to try to improve the protection of journalists around the world. My question is actually in two parts. Have you gotten to present your findings to any senior Israeli officials, and what kind of a response have you gotten? And in terms of your recommendations, we heard one or two. Is there any real chance that they can make a difference while this war is still ongoing? Thank you.
Much, and thank you very much, Edie, for being here. It's always nice to see you here, and the good work that your group here in the UN are doing. Let me say that as far as Israel is concerned, Israel was the only government that actually sent a written submission. Now, I put out a call for submissions for my report to all stakeholders, governmental and non-governmental. The government of Israel did make a submission where, of course, they explained their laws and systems and took the position that the conflict in Gaza was not really of global significance, and my mandate should not engage with it. We have written, I and other special rapporteurs have written to Israel about the violations, for example, in relation to their Media Freedom Act. I have written to them about it because I don't believe that banning an entire media outlet, a foreign media outlet, is a proportionate response to any concern that the Israelis might have. Under international law, yes, you can restrict media, you can restrict freedom of expression, but it has to be proportionate and necessary, which means you have to see on a case-by-case basis what happens. And of course, not only did Israel not take into account my concerns, very soon after that, their Knesset adopted the law, and that law was then applied to Al Jazeera, and then the law was even amended to make the banning permanent. And as you know, it has been extended now to Ramallah, and the offices have been shut down. So, and I have information that inside Israel as well, censorship is going up. So Israeli media is also under pressure, and that I think is very harmful for the people of Israel. Have a right to media diversity. They have a right to listen to different points of view, and that is also being shut down.
Yourself to Ms. Khan, thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Bisan Aboukwek with Al Jazeera Arabic. You had mentioned, of course, the shutdown of our offices, the targeting of not just our journalists, Palestinian journalists in general in Gaza, but most recently our colleague Fadi Al-Wahidi was targeted and now he's paralyzed and he's in a coma. Our network is calling for his evacuation so he can receive medical treatment. If you have any comment on that. And a second part to my question, you mentioned a lot of steps or measures that have been taken to suppress freedom of expression. And we've seen this here in this country in universities and some actually legislation in the US Congress regarding academia and universities, and also conflating anti-Semitism with Zionism. Have you been in touch with anyone in the US Congress or the US administration to discuss some of what you have in your report?
Well, first let me start with the journalists in Gaza, and your colleague is one of the more recent ones. There's been a history of this kind of attack on journalists, and local Gazan journalists who are working for international media or for other, they are the ones who are carrying the brunt of all this because there is no one else to report. And then they're being targeted. And Israel's response publicly, they have not contacted me specifically or responded to my concerns, but publicly has been that they are either suspected of collaborating with Hamas or there was a mistake. And there is evidence, I believe there is evidence to show that there has been some clear targeting. And Israel has never, to this day, really provided any evidence supporting its allegations about journalists. And in this particular case, given the medical condition in which he is, of course he should be evacuated immediately. And there are many other citizens, local residents of Gaza who are in a similar situation as well. The plight of the wounded is terrible, from babies to women to elderly to journalists and others and doctors and others, humanitarian workers themselves. And that is why I think this carnage in Gaza, this genocide, has to stop. And the first response has to be immediately for the victims, the people who are suffering there. And eventually there must be accountability for this, because what is happening, what my main message is that what is happening in Gaza is sending signals around the world that it is okay to do these things because there it's happening in Gaza, and Israel is enjoying absolute impunity, and others around the world will believe that there will be absolute impunity too. And the standards, the basic foundational standards on which the international community stands, the standards of international human rights and humanitarian law, are being pushed down. And that is extremely dangerous for journalists, humanitarian workers, civilians in conflict. But I think for all of us, it is putting all of us in greater danger.
Go ahead.
Hi, Ms. Khan. Javier Otazu from Spanish newswire EFE. Can you please identify which European countries have restricted the most and are still restricting the freedom of expression in this context?
Well, from the research material that I found, as well as information that came from civil society, from activists, from academics, scholars, and others, Germany actually imposed a total ban on protests, pro-Palestinian protests, if you remember, last October. And since then, in various parts of Germany, there have been very specific restrictions that have been placed on pro-Palestinian protests, never on any pro-Israeli protests, but on pro-Palestinian protests consistently. And there have been all sorts of other restrictions also made in terms of slogans or scarves and so on. France tried a similar measure, but the French courts actually threw it out. And in France, there has to be specific assessment made protest by protest. Belgium, Canada, and a few other countries have also done similarly. What we see is a pattern of stricter, more specific restrictions being put on those who seem to be supporting Palestinian rights or trying to show solidarity with Palestinians than others. Even when it is being done on a specific case-by-case basis, we suddenly find these decisions all going in a certain way. And that seems very suspicious.
We can move online. I see there's a question. Abdul Hamid.
Thank you so much for the briefing, Ms. Khan. I really commend you for what you have informed us. and you might be yourself accused of anti-Semitism, the way that Francesca Albanese was. I have a number of questions. I'm sorry, just came back from travel. I have a number of questions, Ms. Khan, and they are interrelated. First, what do you think of UNESCO? I think, in my opinion, UNESCO did not speak out of killing journalists the way you are speaking now. And the second, is there more flagrant case of targeting journalists like the case of Shireen Abu Akleh? I want you to tell us what you have done during this crime, and if you followed the Israeli narrative and how the US tolerated that crime also. And also, if you can address the freedom of expression regarding the question of Palestine in some Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and those who raise the flag also, they get arrested. So we should not also exclude criticizing Arab countries, those from being harassed and arrested for showing solidarity with the Palestinian. And last but not least, about Western values. They've been the outcry when there is a small demonstration in Hong Kong criticizing China. And they speak about freedom of expression and freedom of opinion. But when what they see these Western values, what's called Western values, they see what Israel is doing, then they find always excuses for Israel. How do you tolerate this kind of discrepancy, double standard, and double talk? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me start with the double standards. A press release has been issued, I think, from Geneva on my report, and you will see the heading of it is precisely double standards and discrimination. Because in the human rights, in the very concept of human rights is the notion of universality. So when member states, the same member states that have signed all these conventions and treaties on human rights apply double standards, they are undermining the human rights system. And I do point out in my report that I've also found double standards and this issue applied with social media platforms. Government, social media platforms, their policies are also reflecting the sort of inherent bias there, which of course is extremely damaging. And there are very clear empirical evidence to show that the response, for example, to Ukraine and the war in Ukraine has been markedly different by Western governments as compared to the conflict in Gaza. Whether it is treatment of media or whether it is the impact on civilians. And that kind of double standards is damaging because it destroys public faith in the human rights system. As you are asking questions, people are also asking questions about the sincerity of the issue. It confuses the picture as to what is happening, and it doesn't lead to a solution. It leads to more hatred, more grievances, more distrust at a time when we need to have dialogue to find solutions. Conflicts will not resolve by themselves. So it is very damaging. Now, in the context of other Arab states or other states, in my report, I do cover protests, for example, that were stamped down or reaction against the media in countries like Egypt, in Jordan, in some of the North African countries. There have been, it might have been more subtle. It might not have been, the protests themselves might not have been on the scale in which we have seen in the cities of Western Europe, because those countries themselves have rather restricted, closed systems, which make it difficult for a lot of people to go out and protest. But clearly, and sadly, the Arab countries themselves have not been open to pro-Palestinian support. And the answer, whether in the West or in the Arab countries, have been that the protests are being controlled or prohibited or restricted on grounds of, in the context of Western countries, anti-Semitism and also counter-terrorism. Also, in the case of Arab countries, also they're using this issue that some of these pro-Palestinian protests are actually support for terrorism, meaning Hamas. But when protests, large-scale protests of Palestinian people are being labeled as being support for terrorism, what is actually happening is you are demonizing people for standing up for their rights. The Palestinians a lot of these protest Palestinians have been about occupation, and you're demonizing, you're stigmatizing, and there is an element, I would say, of institutional racism underneath it, anti-Palestinian racism too, when that is happening. Lastly, coming back to the killing of journalists, UNESCO, as you know, keeps the observatory, that record of all journalists killed that was created 30 plus years ago. In terms of protection of journalists, of course, the mandate, the human rights mandate, rests with the United Nations. I work closely with UNESCO on many issues, and I, through my mandate, I'm trying to push all parts of the UN to do their job better on the safety of journalists as well. What I think was interesting, and I want to mention to you, is the reaction I had yesterday in the third committee when I came up with my report. I had a line in there about where are the champions of media freedom, those who champion media freedom, why are we not hearing their voices when a media outlet like Al Jazeera has been banned in Israel and the occupied territories, or when journalists are being killed in Gaza. And I found, very interestingly, delegate after delegate from the European Union, from the US and others, all highlighting this issue, US denouncing the banning of Al Jazeera and supporting my recommendation that the Security Council, for example, needs to adopt another resolution on this issue, and in that resolution make very clear what it's going to do when governments don't follow, don't respect, or belligerents don't respect international humanitarian law, and journalists do get injured or killed. It's about time for the Security Council to put some teeth behind what it is saying. And, there seemed to be some support for that in the third committee. And of course, I'm going to not just stop at listening to nice things in the third committee. I'm going to take them up at their words and now push them hard. But it is possibly, I think there might be a small little chink opening up here now. Firstly, because the situation has worsened very much with regard to journalists on the ground in conflicts. It was very dangerous. And secondly, I think these countries themselves are realizing that their own media outlets, the international media outlets, are also being excluded. And it's actually not very helpful because you're getting distorted stories coming out, or stories not coming out fully. A lot of it is false information, disinformation, misinformation that is very, very detrimental for peace and security. So I think there's an opportunity here for all of us. And thank you to journalists everywhere for the good work you're doing in this. They're pushing out the stories. Killing a journalist doesn't kill the story, as you know the saying. So that is precisely what is happening, and this is one issue on which I am determined to keep pushing it, and I hope I can, I can get the Security Council engaged on it.
Sorry, but yeah. I asked also about Shireen Abu Akleh.
Yes, Shireen Abu, absolutely.
I forgot to introduce myself, Abdel Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi.
I want to, of course, as you know, I have been involved in the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, involved in the case following up with Israel and the US and so on, since it happened a couple of years ago. And I find it's absolutely shameful that Shireen, who was a dual citizen, the US has not been able to get a satisfactory answer out of Israel. And there, all the signals pointed to it. Israeli statements, public statements, acknowledge that she was killed by a bullet from the gun of an Israeli soldier. But then, nothing has happened since then. And that is absolutely disgraceful. Her name is there in that list. And when I talk about total impunity in Israel, of course, she is one of those names. But worse than that, I have been told by Al Jazeera, the bureau chief, your bureau chief in Jerusalem, I met with him in Geneva, and he told me that when they closed the office in Ramallah, they actually he showed me the photo, they had torn down, I think there was a big kind of a poster of Shireen Abu Akleh. Yes. The Israeli soldiers who came in pulled it down. I mean, the vendetta against her was not only while she was alive, but seems to be carried into death. And I find that absolutely despicable, and it has to be called out.
Thank you.
Gabriel, you had a follow-up?
Thank you, Ms. Khan. Gabriel Elizondo from the English language channel of Al Jazeera. Couple questions. Number one is, can you flesh out a little bit more about this Security Council resolution that you say you've been talking to member states about? What specifically do you envision being in that? In a little more detail, if you may. And second question is, you mentioned in your opening remarks that out of all the journalists that have been injured or killed in Gaza, not one single case has been properly investigated, prosecuted, or punished. What can we do to change that?
Thank you very much. On the issue of the Security Council, this is a recommendation that I have put out now. So it's very early stage. I have not specifically sat down with the delegations yet. None of the delegations who spoke up yesterday sort of said, oh no, that's a no-go area. On the contrary, they were saying protection for journalists has to be strengthened. And in other discussions in Geneva, discussions with the International Red Cross, discussions with other UN agencies that are working on the ground, discussions with UNESCO, it's very clear that this issue of protection of journalists during armed conflict needs additional attention now, primarily because it has become more dangerous. On the one hand, there are more ways in which journalists now can be tracked, for example, with digital technology, and surveillance has increased, and so on. And on the other side, the impunity seems to have hardened rather than softened. So on both sides, that sort of creates an imperative now to look at this issue. The value of information has become more appreciated in many ways, and their manipulation of information has grown as well. So as you see belligerents manipulating information, parties from outside the conflict manipulating information, the presence of independent, diverse media becomes even more important on the ground. So I think the imperative is very strong now to re-examine the situation. As I said, the last Security Council has adopted in the last 20 years, 2 resolutions. The last one was in 2016. Between 2016 and now, in 2024, we've seen how the whole information industry has changed. Media, the way you operate on the ground has changed. And that is why I think special protection has to be provided to journalists. And I think the whole issue of access to conflict situations by international media has to be openly affirmed. It has to be clarified that it is not okay to just deny access to international media.
Do you have it?
I think, did you have another question?
What can we do to stop impunity?
What can we do to stop impunity? Well, I have proposed that the UN, again, the proposal has been on the table for a while, but push them again on the issue of independent investigative mechanism. We have called on Israel, everyone's called on Israel, we call on all the countries. Israel is not the only one. As you know, the list of those who enjoy impunity for killing of journalists is very long. And in most cases, impunity occurs because the national state is inactive. And therefore, the international mechanism has to be strengthened. There should be an independent international mechanism to investigate when killings take place. And we saw how whatever happened in the Khashoggi case, whatever truth came out because one of my colleagues, as you remember, Agnes Kalamar, was able to investigate it. And she was able to investigate it because it happened in Turkey. And he was not a Turkish national. Usually when journalists are killed in their own countries, access is extremely difficult. But creating a mechanism, empowering the mechanism, and using the power then of the UN member states to push the country where the journalist is killed to accept the international mechanism. For me, I think that is going to be important. The International Criminal Court has received cases, including that of Shirin Abu Akleh, but the prosecutor has received those cases. But of course, we don't know how it's moving. He claims he's looking at it. That is another weapon, but that's a slow and heavy-moving weapon. I think creating a strong international mechanism and then putting the power of the member states of the UN have to also put pressure on these countries. I was quite blunt with the Third Committee. Many of the people in the room, their governments, should be putting pressure on Israel.
Go ahead. Yes?
One follow-up question on the idea of a Security Council resolution. You talked about both the protection of international media in armed conflict and access, what kind of actions would you like to see the Security Council include in such a resolution for the failure to abide by those provisions?
Well, as you know, the Security Council has a whole range of mechanisms to enforce or to punish if it wants to. And there has been discussion of issues like the U.S. Magnitsky Act, some form of sanctions for countries that consistently allow impunity to thrive. So there's a whole toolbox out there with the UN Security Council should make available where journalists are being consistently killed. If we value, my line always has been information is a survival right. Information is a valuable tool for promoting peace. And here is this tool that is being undermined through the killing of journalists, through excluding diverse media in. And the Security Council should look at that particular tool and strengthen it and improve it. And it has. I think it has all the measures. Of course, the Security Council itself need to think. And I would say that across the P5 member states, all of them have an interest in it. If they look at situations where journalists have been killed, I think all of them have an interest in strengthening the system. There's mutual interest in it, maybe not in the same conflict, but across conflicts, there's mutual interest in strengthening it. And certainly for others in the General Assembly, but the public at large, the media industry itself, this is going to be a very, very important tool for promoting peace, for fighting disinformation, for allowing information to flow out of the area, to hold the perpetrators to account. So from every perspective, I think the role of journalists, your profession has proven it. They're putting their lives on the line. I think the least the UN Security Council can now do is put pen to paper.
Thank you, Ms. Khan, for the briefing. Thank you all for coming. Just a reminder that at 2 p.m. we have another briefing by the Special Rapporteurs on water, food, and housing that will brief you after their presentations to the third committee. Thank you.